What if I told you Prince Harry just launched a lawsuit against his own father, King Charles III, to protect Meghan Markle from being stripped of her title? Sounds unbelievable, right? And yet, it's happening. Not behind palace doors, not in whispers, but in cold, hard legal filings. Yes, a royal lawsuit. A son turning against the monarchy that raised him. A family tearing itself apart in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. And at the center of it all, the woman who was never supposed to wear the crown, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now she may not wear that title much longer. But here's the twist no one expected. Prince Harry isn't just watching it happen. He's fighting back. With lawyers. With witnesses. With everything he's got left. And he's not just suing the monarchy. He's suing his own blood. His own father. The King of England. Let that sink in. How did we get here? Why now? And what on earth could be in those legal documents that sent Buckingham Palace into full-blown lockdown mode? We're going to unpack every twist, every betrayal, every sealed document, and whispered threat in this unprecedented royal war. But before we dive in, ask yourself this. Is this a fight to protect Meghan? Or is it a last desperate bid to rewrite royal history before it rewrites them out completely? Let's start at the moment this all exploded. A war brewing in silence. This isn't just a tabloid feud. This isn't Meghan snubbing Camilla at a garden party, or Harry looking gloomy at a coronation. This is something far more volatile. For months, maybe years, King Charles had been quietly preparing the paperwork to strip Meghan Markle of the Duchess of Sussex title, not out of spite, but out of what palace insiders now call constitutional necessity. And until recently, Harry seemed to be doing nothing. He looked beaten down, detached, almost resigned. But then something snapped, and the quiet war became public. Insiders say it began with a letter, a personal appeal Harry sent to his father, begging him to reconsider. Not for Meghan, but for the dignity of their children, for the memory of Diana, for the monarchy's already bruised soul. The king never responded, but someone else did. Someone leaked the letter to the press. And overnight, the private feud turned into a global circus. Royal watchers dissected every sentence. Tabloids printed it like scripture. Late-night hosts had a field day. But behind the scenes, something even more dramatic was brewing. Harry lawyered up, and not with some junior barrister from LA. He assembled a transatlantic legal team specializing in constitutional law, privacy, and royal privilege. A combination never before seen in a courtroom, because no royal had ever sued a reigning monarch in modern history. Until now. Why this story matters now. Let's step back for a second. To understand how explosive this is, you need to remember something. Titles in the royal family aren't just symbolic. They're power, protection, access. The title Duchess of Sussex carries status, but more importantly, it offers legal cover in certain jurisdictions, especially those tied to the Commonwealth. It gives Meghan diplomatic security when traveling abroad. It allows access to state functions. It validates the legitimacy of their children's titles. Strip that away, and Meghan becomes just Meghan Markle again. A civilian, with no royal shield. And with every tabloid editor, paparazzi lens, and political commentator salivating to take her down. But here's where it gets murkier. According to legal experts close to the case, King Charles may not have the unilateral power to revoke the title, especially when it was granted by letters patent under Queen Elizabeth II. And that's where Harry's lawsuit gets dangerous. Because if he wins, he doesn't just keep Meghan's title. He rewrites how royal authority works. He could weaken the very throne his father sits on, the hidden family battlefield. Make no mistake, this isn't just a legal matter. This is personal. Sources close to the palace say Charles feels deeply betrayed. Not just because of the lawsuit, but because of what he calls Harry's disloyalty to the crown. And for Charles, the crown isn't just a symbol, it's his entire identity. He waited over 70 years to wear it. He endured scandal after scandal. Camilla's humiliation, Diana's ghost, public mockery, infidelity. And yet, he persisted, always playing the long game. And now, his son has thrown a legal grenade into his reign barely 2 years in. But Charles isn't the only one fuming. Prince William, according to royal insiders, is livid, but staying silent. Some believe he's the one pushing Charles behind the scenes. Others think he's trying to maintain distance. Either way, he knows that if this legal battle sets a precedent, his own future could be next. Because if titles can be challenged in court, then what's to stop Prince George's claim one day? And here's the most explosive layer. Some aides believe Meghan and Harry are hoping to use this case to spark international pressure, to get Commonwealth countries, especially those moving toward republic status, to publicly side with them. Imagine that. The King of England being overruled by a coalition of former colonies. The irony would be historic and devastating. Behind Meghan's silence, throughout all this, Meghan has remained eerily quiet. No interviews, no statements, no appearances. But sources say she's anything but calm. Behind closed doors, Meghan has allegedly been furious about the title situation. Not because she cares about status, but because she sees it as a calculated public assassination. A way to paint her as unworthy, as if she was never truly royal to begin with. Remember how the palace always said Meghan didn't fit in? Now they're trying to make that official. And it cuts deeper than we know. This title was part of the deal. The deal she left her acting career for. The deal she moved across the world for. The deal she built her entire global image on. Strip it away, and she's not just being erased from the royal family. She's being erased from history. And yet, Harry's move to sue came as a surprise to even her, sources claim. Because until recently, Meghan wanted to handle things quietly. But Harry? He's done playing quiet. The lawsuit no one saw coming. Here's what we know about the case so far. Filed in a private London court under legal discretion orders. Cited as a challenge to unlawful interference in inherited titles. Names Charles III not just as monarch, but as a personal party in violation of royal covenant. Contains sealed affidavits from 3 former royal aides, and possibly 1 senior royal. Requests an injunction against the title revocation and a full review of royal power as it pertains to hereditary titles granted prior to the current reign. Translation? Harry isn't just fighting for Meghan. He's going for the jugular. He's challenging the king's ability to rule. And that, my friends, is not just a scandal. That's a constitutional crisis in the making. So what happens next? Does Charles retaliate and revoke the Duke of Sussex title too? Do Commonwealth countries take sides? Will this go to public court? Or is there a secret tribunal already at play? You'll find out everything. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What would you write to the man who raised you if he was about to erase your wife from history? That's the question Prince Harry had to face. And he didn't answer it with silence. He answered it with a pen, a letter. One that would become the first domino in a royal implosion no one could stop. It wasn't official. It wasn't legal. It wasn't even typed. It was handwritten. By Harry. Alone. At night. On Windsor-crested stationery, folded with trembling fingers and delivered by a private courier under absolute secrecy. At least, that was the plan. Because within 72 hours, that very letter, meant for King Charles's eyes only, would be plastered across UK tabloids. Its words dissected, its margins scrutinized, its tone mocked, its sincerity questioned. But why did Harry write the letter in the first place? And why did it become the spark that ignited a lawsuit against the most powerful man in Britain? Let's go back to the beginning of that week. The final warning. It started with a phone call. Not from Charles. Not even from a palace aide. From a friend. A well-placed friend. Harry, we're hearing it's moving forward. Quietly. Behind the scenes. The title revocation committee is reconvening. Meghan's name is on the list. That was the message. Now, most people don't know this. But there's an actual committee inside the royal household that exists specifically to review and recommend changes to royal titles. Normally, it deals with ceremonial clarifications, marriage-related adjustments, and obscure peerage debates. But this time it had teeth. Because Charles had allegedly given the green light to review Meghan's right to retain Duchess of Sussex. No announcement. No press release. Just a quiet sword drawn behind velvet curtains. And Harry, realizing the quiet war had finally turned lethal, did the only thing he felt he could still do, appeal to his father as a son, not as a subject. So he wrote, not through lawyers, not through PR agents, not through palace courtiers. He picked up a fountain pen and began to write in his own voice. Inside the letter, while the full letter has never been officially released, multiple sources, including royal correspondents, ex-palace aides, and legal analysts, have confirmed key details. And they are devastating. It opened with a single line. "I ask you this not as your son, but as a father, a husband, and a man trying to protect the people he loves." From there, the tone became emotional, earnest, vulnerable. He reminded Charles of the pain Meghan had endured under royal scrutiny. The racism, the rejection, the way she was excluded from core family decisions, the snubs, the protocol traps, the headlines she was expected to swallow with a curtsy. He reminded him of Diana, of how stripping dignity with cold titles once led to tabloid chaos, public grief, and ultimately tragedy. But the most searing part came halfway through. "You may strip a title, but you cannot erase truth. And you cannot erase me." It was Harry saying, "This isn't just about Meghan. This is about who I am now, and what I will stand for." The letter closed with a final plea. "If there is still a place for compassion in this monarchy, show it now." He sealed it, signed it, and sent it, by hand, through a trusted courier to Clarence House. And for a brief moment, he believed it might work. But then, the leak heard round the world. 3 days later, excerpts from the letter appeared in a British tabloid. Then in another. Then another. Within hours, it became front-page news across the globe. "Harry begs King Charles to spare Meghan. Emotional letter leaked." Journalists pounced. Royal commentators speculated. TV panels argued over every phrase. Was Harry groveling? Was this emotional blackmail? Was he trying to guilt the king into submission? The palace, as always, said nothing. But make no mistake, this wasn't an accidental leak. It was a tactic, a preemptive strike, a way to spin the narrative before Harry could control it. Because here's the dirty truth of palace politics. Leaking isn't a mistake. It's a message. And this message was loud and clear. "We're not afraid of you anymore." Meghan's reaction. When Meghan found out about the leak, she was not shocked. She was furious. According to sources close to her, the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. This wasn't just about losing a title. It was about being humiliated in public again. Used, twisted, made to look like the villain in her own marriage. Insiders say she confronted Harry about the leak within minutes. "Who did this? Was it your father? Was it William?" Harry didn't have an answer, but in his gut, he felt the answer. And it tasted like blood, finger-pointing behind palace walls. As the media storm exploded, whispers inside Buckingham Palace turned into full-blown suspicion. Who leaked it? Some pointed fingers at Camilla's camp, alleging that her communications aide had ties to certain friendly editors in the tabloid world. Others suggested William's team, known for their strategic, unofficial briefings to control media narratives, might have pushed the story to deflate Harry's credibility. Still others blamed a palace mole, a longtime staffer with a grudge, perhaps paid off or manipulated. But one theory gained traction quickly. The leak wasn't accidental. It was a palace-approved move to destroy Harry's leverage. If the letter was public, it couldn't be used as private evidence of emotional abuse or retaliation in court. In other words, they were neutralizing Harry before he could strike. The quiet fury of the king. Meanwhile, King Charles remained silent. No public statement. No press conference. No response to the letter. But insiders say he was livid. Not at the leak. At the letter itself. He saw it as manipulative. Emotional blackmail dressed in paternal sentiment. A betrayal. He reportedly told aides. If he wanted a war, he has it. He's just made it formal. And with that, something shifted inside Clarence House. According to one high-ranking aide, Charles gave a single instruction to his legal team. Prepare the paperwork. Meghan loses the title. No more delays. No more diplomacy. Just a final, devastating act of royal vengeance. But Harry wasn't done. Because just as the palace was preparing to make the move official, Harry was preparing a response of his own. Not a letter. Not a call. Not a PR campaign. But a lawsuit. The legal team assembles. In a rented townhouse in London, Harry met with a secret team of legal advisors. 2 from the UK, 1 from the US, and 1 constitutional scholar with ties to the European Court of Human Rights. Their goal? Find a legal route to challenge the monarchy's ability to revoke a title granted under the previous sovereign's authority. It was complicated, risky, maybe even impossible. But there was a sliver of legal ambiguity in the original letter's patent, granting the Sussex titles in 2018. And Harry's lawyers thought they could exploit it. All they needed was proof of malicious intent. And guess what? The leak, that leaked letter, could be the proof they needed. Irony of ironies. The weapon used to humiliate Harry and Meghan might be the very document that brings the monarchy to its knees in court. Back in Montecito, while all this unfolded in London, Meghan remained in California. But her silence wasn't apathy. According to close friends, she was making private phone calls to legal contacts, media allies, and former palace staffers. Not to build support, but to gather witnesses. People who had seen how the title situation evolved. People who had overheard conversations. People with memos, messages, and maybe even recordings. Because this wasn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It was about building a counter-narrative. One that showed intentional harm. That framed the royal institution not as a neutral entity, but as an aggressive actor targeting a woman for who she was, not what she did. And then, another shock. Just as Harry's legal team was finalizing the first draft of the lawsuit, someone inside the palace reached out. An anonymous message, encrypted, sent through a secure channel used by journalists and whistleblowers. The message said, "I know who leaked the letter, and it wasn't who you think. Check the call logs. March 12th, between 10:06 and 10:14 a.m. Clarence House. You'll find your answer." That tip would blow the case wide open. Because what they found next didn't just change the strategy. It changed everything. What if the person who leaked Harry's private letter wasn't a royal aide, wasn't a disgruntled staffer, and wasn't even someone with an obvious motive, but someone inside the monarchy whose betrayal would shake the entire foundation of the crown? That's the question Harry's team had to confront the moment that anonymous message came in. Because the moment they saw those words, "Check the call logs, March 12th, Clarence House," they realized something terrifying. Whoever sent that message wasn't guessing. They weren't speculating. They weren't spinning a rumor. They were pointing directly, surgically, at a specific moment in time, a digital fingerprint hidden deep inside palace communications. And if that fingerprint belonged to who they suspected, then the monarchy didn't just have a mole. It had a saboteur, a ghost working from within, weaponizing information with precision. And that meant one thing. Harry wasn't fighting an institution. He was fighting a person, a specific person, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The next 48 hours inside Harry's legal camp were chaos. Phones buzzing, screens glowing, experts poring over technical data, lawyers whispering in corners, and all of them asking the same question. Who had access to that letter between the time Harry's courier delivered it and the moment the tabloids miraculously learned of its contents? At first glance, it seemed impossible to narrow down. The royal household is sprawling. Multiple offices, dozens of private secretaries, communications aides, security staff, archivists, protocol officers, personal support staff, clerks, advisors, and the occasional consultant wandering in and out. But when the team cross-referenced the tip with internal palace structures, a horrifying realization emerged. The exact window of time provided by the whistleblower matched almost perfectly with the moment Harry's letter passed through a single office. An office with minimal staff, heavily restricted access, and the authority to preview personal correspondence addressed to the monarch for security reasons. That office belonged to King Charles's senior correspondence clerk, a man known for decades of loyalty, discretion, and his signature habit of never appearing in the press. A quiet man. An invisible man. A man whose entire job revolved around reading what the monarch reads before the monarch reads it. But here's the twist. He wasn't the mole. At least, not directly. Because as Harry's team dug deeper, something didn't add up. The correspondence clerk didn't have a motive. He didn't have external political alliances. He didn't have connections to tabloid journals. He didn't have a reputation for leaking. But what he did have was a direct reporting line to someone who did have motive. Someone with power. Someone with influence. Someone who had everything to gain from humiliating Harry and weakening his legal argument before it even began. And that someone was King Charles's newly promoted deputy private secretary, a man known for his strategic brilliance, his sharp elbows, and his unapologetic belief that the monarchy must protect itself first, family second. A man who once said in a staff meeting, "Emotion is the enemy of royalty." A man who reportedly saw Harry and Meghan as a vulnerability vector that needed to be neutralized. Is it possible this man orchestrated the leak? Yes, but the real question is, why? Here's where things take a darker turn. According to one former palace aide, who requested anonymity when speaking with Harry's team, the deputy private secretary had been quietly lobbying King Charles for months to resolve the Sussex issue before the king's health became a political conflict. That term, the Sussex issue, was used repeatedly in internal memos. It referred to everything from Meghan's stalled patronages to Harry's memoir to the couple's growing influence in the U.S. media market. But under the surface, it meant something else entirely. The perception that Meghan's title, and therefore her association with the crown, was generating political friction in Commonwealth nations where monarchic legitimacy was already fragile. Australia, Canada, Jamaica, Barbados, New Zealand. Leaders in several of those countries had, over the past 2 years, allegedly expressed discomfort with Meghan's high-profile activism and the perception that the monarchy was using her American celebrity status to maintain cultural relevance. Fair or not, the deputy private secretary saw her title as a liability, not an asset. And so, according to the whistleblower, he made a choice, an aggressive, calculated, cold choice. He couldn't force the king's hand immediately. But he could accelerate the timeline, pressure the palace, tighten the noose around Harry and Meghan's influence. And the best way to do that? Leak the letter. Make it public. Make it emotional. Make it messy. Make Harry look desperate. Make Meghan look dependent. Make Charles look victimized. Most importantly, make any future legal argument Harry could raise look like retaliation rather than constitutional defense. Because if the public saw Harry appealing privately before going nuclear, the palace could frame the narrative as, the king tried to handle this quietly. Harry chose war. But what the deputy private secretary miscalculated was Harry's resolve, and Meghan's fury, and the fact that someone on the inside, someone with access to the truth, had finally had enough and decided to tip them off. When Harry and his legal team finally obtained the call logs, the pieces fell into place. A single outgoing call from the deputy private secretary's office to a well-known tabloid journalist at exactly 10:11 a.m. on March 12th. The call lasted 1 minute and 38 seconds. That's all it took. 98 seconds to trigger a global firestorm. 98 seconds to weaponize a son's private plea to his father. 98 seconds to damage Meghan's reputation so severely that the palace could justify stripping her title under the guise of public interest and preservation of constitutional decorum. Does that phrase sound vague? It's meant to. It was reportedly the exact language drafted for the internal memo that would later become the foundation for the title revocation proposal. Now, here's where the emotional contradiction hits hardest. Because while the deputy private secretary was moving pieces behind the scenes like a monarchist chess master, Charles himself had no idea the leak originated from his own office. Think about that. The King of England, surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and strategists, was being puppeteered without realizing it. Harry's legal team debated whether Charles was complicit, negligent, or simply outmaneuvered. But one thing was clear: the leak wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was a strategic strike orchestrated from the inside of the king's own inner circle, and the fallout would have been devastating no matter what. But for Harry, it was personal, because the leak didn't just humiliate him. It exposed his private pain. It exposed Meghan to mockery. It endangered his lawsuit. And most importantly, it shattered any lingering belief he had that reconciliation with his father was still possible. The irony? The deputy private secretary believed this move would end the Sussex threat, but instead, it poured gasoline on an already raging fire. Because the moment Harry saw that connection, saw the evidence, saw the logs, saw the truth, he realized something he hadn't fully accepted until that moment. This wasn't a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, or a breach of etiquette. This was an attack, a deliberate attack, and you don't negotiate with someone who's waging war against you in the shadows. You expose them. You fight them. You force them into the light. But before Harry could act, before his legal team could strike, before Meghan could respond, something else happened. Something even more explosive. Something that proved the mole wasn't acting alone. Something that showed the rot in the monarchy wasn't confined to one office. but was part of a much deeper, much more dangerous network of influence. And when Harry discovered that next connection, it changed the entire trajectory of the lawsuit. It changed the public narrative. It changed the family dynamics. And it revealed a betrayal bigger than the leak, bigger than the letter, and bigger than the title itself. What they found next didn't just point to a mole. It pointed to a conspiracy. What happens when you realize your name, your identity, your dignity, isn't just being debated behind your back, it's being deleted in real time? That was the question Meghan Markle faced as she sat alone in the Montecito estate kitchen, scrolling through headlines that dissected not just her title, but her very right to exist within the royal family. And this wasn't a tabloid rumor. It wasn't an anonymous tweet. This was confirmed, coordinated. Coming from people who had once stood beside her at palace banquets, smiled with her on the Buckingham balcony, and spoken platitudes about modern monarchy while secretly sharpening their knives. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was exile. And Meghan, cornered, livid, and emotionally drained, was ready to fight. But not the way the palace expected. Let's rewind to that day. Meghan had been in Los Angeles for a private meeting with a documentary producer when her phone blew up. Texts from her lawyer, emails from her publicist, a missed call from Harry. She stepped into a quiet corner of the hotel and opened the first message. It's been confirmed. They're proceeding with the title revocation. Charles is moving forward. For a full minute, she didn't speak. She didn't even blink. She just stared at the screen, her grip tightening, her jaw locking into that now famous expression, the one that's half composure, half controlled fury. Because for Meghan, the title wasn't about ego. It was about survival. The Duchess of Sussex wasn't just a fancy label. It was a legal buffer, a diplomatic layer, a shield from the endless character assassination campaigns waged in the shadows. That title afforded her a measure of protection when traveling abroad. It silenced critics who called her an outsider. It validated the legitimacy of her children's inheritance. And most importantly, it anchored her to a legacy that she had fought tooth and nail to join. Strip that away, and you don't just remove a title. You erase her completely from the institution's narrative. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. But here's the part the palace never understood. Meghan doesn't retreat when threatened. She recalibrates. Within hours of the news breaking, she summoned a closed-door meeting at her Montecito home. Present, her legal advisor, her U.S.-based crisis manager, her brand strategist, and, quietly, two former British aides who had left the royal household years earlier under suspicious circumstances. The tone in that room was icy. No small talk. No sympathy. Meghan opened the meeting with one sentence. If they want war, they just picked the wrong target. That meeting, according to sources close to her inner circle, was the moment Meghan flipped the switch. No more measured statements. No more trying to play dignified while being slowly dismembered by royal protocol. She was done waiting. Done hoping Harry's letter would change anything. She was now moving on two parallel tracks, legal defense and narrative offense. And her first move was subtle, but explosive. She authorized her legal team to begin compiling a dossier. A timeline of every interaction, message, and internal memo she had access to that hinted at discrimination, retaliation, or calculated exclusion by senior royal staff. Every microaggression, every protocol manipulation, every email she'd been CC'd on where decisions had clearly been made about her without her input. This wasn't petty. This was documentation. Ammunition. The beginning of a case that would frame the palace not as a royal institution, but as a toxic employer engaged in coordinated brand sabotage. Meanwhile, back in London, the palace remained silent. Not a single official word from Charles, Clarence House, or Kensington Palace. But silence wasn't peace. It was strategy, because behind those gilded doors, a very different meeting was taking place. Charles, reportedly furious at the press coverage of the leaked letter and the growing support for Harry and Meghan in American media, called an emergency advisory session. Present, his private secretary, legal counsel, and, most notably, two constitutional advisors with ties to the Privy Council. According to insiders, Charles was no longer asking for recommendations. He was demanding execution. His plan? Finalize the title revocation protocol and announce it before Harry's legal filing could be formalized. The goal wasn't just to strip Meghan of the title. It was to render any lawsuit moot by acting before it was officially lodged. But in doing so, Charles walked directly into the one trap he'd been warned to avoid. Because while Harry was preparing to challenge the constitutionality of a title revocation granted by a former monarch, Meghan was preparing to challenge the motivation. And that's where the palace was vulnerable. Because if they were seen as acting in retaliation to personal grievances and not in the interest of the crown, they could be exposed legally and politically. And Meghan wasn't bluffing. Her legal team began discreetly contacting former royal employees, assistants, stylists, and even press officers who had witnessed what she described as a sustained campaign of erasure. Some declined to speak, but others? They were ready. One former aide, speaking off record, said, "We all knew Meghan was being iced out. There were meetings about meetings that excluded her. She'd get protocol updates after the press did. They wanted her out, but they wanted her to leave on her own, so they could say she couldn't handle it." This wasn't just behind-the-scenes drama. It was now potential evidence. And Meghan knew that to win this battle, she didn't just need facts, she needed emotional resonance. That's when she authorized one more move. She reached out, quietly, personally, to a high-profile American interviewer known for explosive, empathy-driven sit-downs. The ask wasn't to do an interview. Not yet. The ask was simple. "If I speak, will they listen this time?" The response came within the hour. "Yes, but be ready to go all in." Back in London, Charles remained unaware that the legal and emotional narrative was slipping out of his control. He had no idea Meghan was organizing her own army, that Harry's team had traced the leak, that behind the smiles and polo matches, the Sussexes were preparing to do what no royal had ever dared before: put the monarchy on trial in the court of law and public opinion at the same time. But just when Meghan thought she was controlling the chaos, when she believed she had a plan, an advantage, a path forward, she received a call that shattered her confidence. Not from Harry, not from her lawyers. From Buckingham Palace. The voice on the line was formal, calm, clinical. "You are requested to appear for a private audience with His Majesty King Charles III. Location, Sandringham House. Attendance is not mandatory, but is strongly advised." For Meghan, the invitation was more than a shock. It was a trap, because this wasn't a public mediation. This wasn't even a legal negotiation. This was the monarchy calling her in for a final verdict. No press, no recordings, no witnesses, just her, the king, and the people who had spent the past 5 years trying to erase her. And here's the twist. She said yes, but on one condition. She would not go alone. And who she chose to bring with her would send shockwaves through the palace corridors. Because it wasn't Harry. It wasn't her lawyer. It wasn't her mother. It was someone the king had never expected to see again. Someone whose presence would reopen old wounds and reveal long-buried secrets. What would you say to the man trying to erase you, if you knew it might be the last time you'd ever speak to him face to face? That was the question Meghan Markle carried with her as she stepped into the back of a blacked-out SUV bound for Sandringham House. But she wasn't alone. Sitting silently beside her was the one person whose very existence still unsettled Buckingham Palace. Not a family member, not a lawyer, not a staffer, but a ghost from the institution's darkest, most uncomfortable chapter: Princess Diana's former private secretary. A man who knew too much. A man who had stayed silent for decades. A man who had nothing to lose. The decision to bring him wasn't made lightly. Meghan had called him in secret the night before. Her voice was calm, but clipped. She didn't beg. She simply laid out the facts. "They're trying to strip me of everything. Not for what I've done, but for who I am. And I know you saw it happen before. I need you in the room, not to speak, but to witness. Because I don't trust what they'll say once the doors close." There was a pause on the line. And then the reply: "I'll be there. But understand, if Charles sees me, he'll know this isn't a negotiation. It's war." The drive to Sandringham was slow, tense. Rain tapped the windows like a metronome counting down to detonation. Meghan stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. No makeup, no entourage, no photographers. She wore a tailored navy coat, simple pearl earrings, and an expression so composed it bordered on defiant. She wasn't there to beg. She was there to make it clear: "I see you. I know what this is, and I won't go quietly." When they arrived, they were ushered through a side entrance. No staff announcements, no pageantry. Just a quiet nod from a stone-faced equerry who led them to a private sitting room overlooking the estate gardens. The room was cold. On purpose. Meghan could feel it. The thermostat was always a weapon in the palace. The message was clear. This isn't your home. This isn't your house. This is where your story ends. And then, after 12 minutes of silence, King Charles entered. He wasn't in royal regalia. Just a navy suit, white shirt, and thin tie. But the weight of the crown was unmistakable. His expression? Cold. Not cruel. Not angry. Just resolute. Like a man who had already made peace with the damage he was about to inflict. For a moment, he said nothing. He just looked at Meghan, and then at the man seated beside her. His eyes narrowed. "You brought him," Charles said, barely concealing the tension. Meghan didn't blink. "I brought a witness," she replied. Silence again. Charles sat. Then the games began. The conversation began with polite formalities. A few phrases about the institution, duty, precedent. But within 5 minutes, the truth cracked through. Charles cleared his throat and said flatly, "Meghan, the title of Duchess of Sussex is no longer tenable. It has become a source of tension. Politically, publicly, privately. I must act." Meghan didn't flinch. "Act based on what?" she asked. "What exactly have I done that makes the title untenable?" Charles looked down at the file in front of him, a manila folder that might as well have been a coffin. "Your public comments. The press appearances. The associations. There are concerns." Meghan leaned forward. "So not my actions. The reactions to my existence. That's what you're punishing." Charles's jaw tightened. "It's not punishment. It's preservation." There it was. Preservation. The monarchy's favorite word when it means destruction. The conversation spiraled. Meghan pressed him. On the leak, on the timing, on the motive. Charles deflected. Repeated the same line. "It's not personal." But Meghan knew better. This wasn't about protocol. It was about narrative control. About a king trying to erase the one part of his reign he couldn't control, the woman who refused to play along. And then, just as the meeting seemed to be winding down, just as Charles stood to leave, the real reason for the invitation emerged. He turned back to Meghan and said quietly, "If you walk out of here without agreeing to relinquish the title voluntarily, the palace will proceed unilaterally. And that will open the floodgates. Every document, every briefing, every internal complaint. You won't just lose the title. You'll lose your name." It was a threat, dressed in silk, but a threat nonetheless. And Meghan? She smiled. Not out of joy, not out of nerves, but out of recognition. Because now she knew something for certain. They were scared. Not of her power, but of her proof. She stood up, looked Charles in the eye, and said with chilling calm, "Then you'd better make sure you get it all out now. Because once I speak, you won't get another word in before the world takes your microphone." She turned, walked out, her witness behind her. The door closed with a quiet click, but the sound it made inside the palace was deafening. Because that wasn't the sound of a door shutting. It was the sound of the last chance at peace evaporating into smoke. But what no one knew, not Meghan, not Charles, not even Harry, was that while the meeting was happening in Sandringham, something else was unfolding in London. Something urgent, something legal, something that would derail the palace's plan in less than 24 hours and force the king into an impossible corner. What happens when you try to silence someone, and instead, you give them a microphone with global reach, legal backing, and a vendetta fueled by royal betrayal? That's exactly what King Charles did the moment Meghan Markle walked out of Sandringham. Dignity intact, and jaw clenched like a soldier returning from battle. Because even as the king prepared the final paperwork to strip her of her duchess title, believing he had backed her into a corner, he had unknowingly triggered a counterattack already in motion. By the time Charles's aides were drafting press statements and damage control memos, Harry's legal team had already taken action. And not just symbolic action. Real, legal, institution-shaking action that sent shockwaves through both Buckingham Palace and the British government. It started with a single line. The very first sentence of the confidential document filed in the High Court of Justice read, "This suit seeks to examine the constitutional overreach of sovereign powers in matters of hereditary title revocation, and whether such actions constitute targeted retaliation against a legally recognized duchess under letters patent issued during the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Plain English? Prince Harry just sued the king. and not just as monarch, but as a private citizen, an individual acting against a granted royal decree for personal or political motives. The implications? Staggering. Because for the first time in modern royal history, someone inside the bloodline was openly questioning whether the monarch still had the unchecked authority to rewrite legacy law based on emotional bias. The case was filed under emergency privacy conditions, but as with all things royal, nothing stays quiet for long. Within 36 hours, word had leaked, not from Harry's side, but from government insiders alarmed by what the lawsuit might expose. Behind the scenes, the Prime Minister's office was briefed. Cabinet members raised eyebrows. The Ministry of Justice quietly requested a copy of the sealed filing. Why? Because the very idea that Charles's actions might violate constitutional precedent could destabilize not just the monarchy, but Parliament's tolerance for it. But what exactly was in the lawsuit? Let's break it down. First, the legal foundation. Harry's team argued that the letters patent issued by Queen Elizabeth in 2018 formally granted the titles of Duke and Duchess of Sussex not just by tradition, but by a monarch's fixed act of law. That means the titles weren't simply gifts. They were legal recognitions rooted in the monarch's sovereign power at the time, revoking them after the issuing sovereign's death, especially based on actions that occurred outside of British jurisdiction, like Meghan's U.S. press interviews or philanthropic ventures, may constitute an abuse of inherited authority. Second, the motive angle. The lawsuit boldly claims that the decision to strip Meghan's title is not grounded in constitutional integrity or public interest, but in personal grievance and institutional retaliation. In layman's terms, Harry accused his own father of punishing his wife not because she broke rules, but because she broke ranks. That accusation alone sent legal analysts and royal historians scrambling, because if proven, it could open the door to re-examining other royal decisions, past and present, as potentially arbitrary or retaliatory. Third, the evidence. While the full submission remains sealed, sources close to the case say Harry's team included internal documents, testimony from ex-royal staff, and, most explosively, a leaked memo allegedly drafted by Charles's deputy private secretary months before the revocation process began, outlining strategies to neutralize the Sussex narrative. The wording is surgical, cold, clinical. In one section, the memo allegedly references Meghan as a variable brand liability and recommends preemptive title recalibration to preserve institutional dignity. If this document exists and is admitted into evidence, it won't just undermine Charles's argument. It will eviscerate it. And then came the real twist. Meghan was not listed as a plaintiff. Only Harry. Why? Because according to legal experts advising the couple, the optics of a husband fighting to protect his wife, rather than Meghan appearing to fight for her own title, would resonate more deeply with public sentiment and judicial objectivity. Meghan, for now, would remain a symbol of unjust punishment, while Harry carried the sword of reform. But make no mistake, this was a dual effort. Meghan's team was feeding data to Harry's legal camp, timeline corroborations, media correspondence, private texts showing how long the palace had been trying to orchestrate a public humiliation. Every scrap of documentation was now a weapon in a war the monarchy never thought it would have to fight in a courtroom. And the timing? Perfect. Because the palace had planned to release the title revocation statement on the final Friday of the month, quietly, right before the weekend media lull. But the lawsuit landed on Wednesday morning, which meant by Thursday afternoon, the press was already flooding the airwaves with headlines not about Meghan being punished, but about Harry taking on the crown. Suddenly, the palace was no longer in control of the narrative. And Charles? He was furious. Sources say the king exploded behind closed doors. Accusations flew. Who leaked? Who missed the timing? Who failed to anticipate Harry's countermove? But beneath the anger, there was something else. Something colder. A question Charles reportedly asked his legal advisor in private, not as a monarch, but as a father. Does he even want to come back? Or is this it? It was the first time Charles openly acknowledged, to anyone, that this lawsuit might not just cost him control. It might cost him his son. Forever. But the clock was already ticking. Because once the court agreed to hear the case, and legal insiders confirmed that preliminary approval had already been granted, there was no stopping the next phase, discovery, which meant Harry's team could now formally request internal communications, emails, meeting minutes, and private memos relating to Meghan's treatment inside the palace. That's the part the monarchy feared most. Not the lawsuit, not the verdict, but the exposure. Because discovery means transparency. Discovery means receipts. Discovery means no more hiding behind palace statements and no comment press releases. And as that reality set in, something shifted inside Meghan too. She wasn't just defending a title anymore. She was preparing to tell her story, but not in a way the palace had ever seen coming. Because just as Charles was preparing his defense, and Harry's lawyers were sharpening theirs, Meghan began preparing for something else entirely, a public reckoning. One that wouldn't be filed in court. One that would be broadcast around the world. And when it aired, it would change public perception in ways the monarchy couldn't reverse. Because while Charles had the crown, Meghan had the camera. What do you do when the son you raised turns your throne into a courtroom, and the daughter-in-law you tried to erase becomes a martyr for the modern age? If you're King Charles III, you don't beg. You don't cry. And you sure as hell don't fold. You retaliate. You bring in the one man who doesn't blink in the face of scandal, doesn't flinch under public scrutiny, and doesn't care how many centuries of royal tradition he has to burn to win. His name? Sir Malcolm Drayton. But behind closed doors, everyone in Westminster has a different name for him. The Crown's blade. Sir Malcolm isn't a palisade. He isn't a PR man. He's not even a traditional attorney. He's a former intelligence operative turned legal architect. A man trained not in courtrooms, but in confidential military tribunals. A shadow figure brought in by the Crown during moments so sensitive, the public never even hears about them. He's handled leaks that could have toppled ministers. He's buried scandals involving ambassadors, princes, even a prime minister's son. And now, Charles had summoned him for one purpose only: to neutralize Harry's legal war without letting it spill further into public view. Sir Malcolm's strategy was cold, swift, and surgical. The first move? Discredit the lawsuit. Not in the courtroom, in the court of public opinion. Within days of the case becoming known to government insiders, royal-friendly journalists began running exclusive op-eds questioning Harry's legal standing. Articles popped up citing senior legal scholars who argued that challenging the king's title authority was constitutionally incoherent. Media pundits spun theories that Harry was emotionally unstable, easily manipulated, and waging the case to settle psychological scores rather than legal ones. These weren't organic takes. These were seeded narratives. Sir Malcolm's fingerprints were all over them. Then came the leaks, strategic, controlled, devastating. A confidential briefing from the Home Office suggesting that Harry's lawsuit was putting national security interests at risk by potentially opening up the monarchy to hostile legal precedents. Think about that. The monarchy, an institution propped up by centuries of decorum, now being shielded behind the language of terrorism legislation and intelligence oversight. It was ridiculous, but it was effective. Parliament began whispering. What if this opens the door to foreign actors demanding royal reforms? What if this causes a constitutional crisis? Suddenly, Harry's case wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. But Sir Malcolm wasn't done. His second move was more direct. Counterfiling. A legal notice was submitted to the High Court on behalf of the Crown seeking to dismiss Harry's case on the grounds of non-justiciability, a legal term that basically says, this issue is above the courts. It belongs to the sovereign. In other words, Sir Malcolm wanted the judge to throw the case out before it ever went to discovery. A gamble, yes, but a clever one. If successful, it would prevent Harry from dragging internal palace memos and communication into the light. It would seal the vault before the public ever saw the contents. But it gets darker, because while this legal chess game played out in the background, Sir Malcolm launched a third prong: reputational attrition. He quietly greenlit a series of background probes into Harry and Meghan's business ventures, their nonprofit finances, their brand endorsements, even their security arrangements. The goal wasn't to find something criminal. The goal was to find doubt. Something, anything, that could be leaked to paint them as opportunists. Are they using their royal status for financial gain? Is their charity misreporting tax status? Are they coordinating with foreign media outlets to smear the royal family? These weren't allegations. They were questions. And that's all Sir Malcolm needed to plant. Because in public relations, you don't have to prove something to damage someone. You just have to get people to wonder. And guess what? It started working. Poll numbers in the UK began shifting. Overnight, surveys showed growing frustration with Harry. Not hatred, just exhaustion. Why can't he let it go? He left. Why is he still fighting? Is he just addicted to drama? In the US, the backlash was slower, but it came. Cable news segments questioned Meghan's silence. Talk show hosts joked about the lawsuit. The narrative began to change, not from victim versus oppressor, but messy family drama no one wanted to hear about anymore. Sir Malcolm had successfully dragged the story from the courtroom into the mud. But here's where the twist hits. While Charles believed Malcolm was protecting him, the truth is more uncomfortable. Sir Malcolm wasn't loyal to him. He was loyal to the institution, the crown, the concept of monarchy as a stable power structure, which meant if protecting the throne required sacrificing Charles's image, or even cutting off Harry entirely. So be it. And Charles? He knew that, and it terrified him. Because while Harry and Meghan had gone public with their fight, Charles was now at the mercy of a man who didn't care about sentiment, legacy, or even fatherhood. Sir Malcolm was a strategist. And the crown was a fortress he intended to preserve, by any means necessary. Behind the scenes, Charles began to unravel. Multiple sources reported tension inside Clarence's house. Staff quit. Communications teams clashed over messaging. Charles allegedly refused to appear at a scheduled charity event, citing fatigue. But insiders said the real reason was simple. He no longer knew how to wear the crown without looking like the villain. And then, Meghan struck. While Sir Malcolm flooded the media with half-truths and smokescreens, Meghan appeared, unannounced, at a private gala in Los Angeles hosted by a major global women's foundation. No press release. No red carpet. Just a raw, unscripted moment that sent shockwaves through every news cycle. She was handed the mic unexpectedly. The room expected a generic thank you. Instead, she said this: "There comes a time when silence is no longer grace. When dignity becomes defense. When standing up for yourself means standing alone. And if that day ever comes for you, do it anyway. Because titles fade. Power fades. But truth, that stays. And the truth is, I'm not afraid of losing a title. I'm afraid of my daughter growing up thinking she's not allowed to be loud." The room erupted. Not with noise, but with something heavier. Recognition. The clip went viral. Millions of views in hours. International coverage. Social media trends exploded. She's fighting for her daughter. She's not backing down. She's already won. And just like that, Sir Malcolm's carefully constructed smear wall cracked. Because Meghan didn't need to release documents. She didn't need to sue. She just needed to speak. The court of public opinion reignited. And the royal legal team? Scrambling. But that wasn't even the worst part. Because just 2 days later, Harry's lawyers received a confidential document, anonymous source. No signature. No return contact. Just one page. A transcript. A meeting between senior palace officials. And a single line that changed the case overnight. What if the people you once trusted to shape your story were now using your words to destroy you? Leaked, twisted, and sold to the highest bidder. That was the nightmare Meghan Markle woke up to as she sat in her Montecito home, staring at the screen of her iPad while a newly leaked video clip played on loop. The headline above it screamed, "Unseen Meghan footage. They'll never accept me. So why pretend?" It had been sent anonymously to a celebrity gossip blogger, picked up by TMZ. Then Daily Mail. Then Sky News. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Just under 2 minutes. Shaky footage. Low lighting. But Meghan's voice was unmistakable. Her tone, measured, slightly bitter, tinged with weariness. I played their game. Smiled at the cameras. Wore their beige. Walked behind them like a good little wife. And for what? They'll never accept me. So why pretend? The video wasn't damning. But it didn't need to be. It was raw. Unfiltered. And it showed the Meghan the palace had always warned about. The one who didn't conform. The one who spoke out. The one who challenged the natural order. The problem? The clip wasn't from a public event. Or even a media interview. It was private footage. Captured in the early days of post-royal life. Shot during a pitch session with Hollywood producers when Meghan and Harry were exploring future projects with Amazon, MGM, and Netflix. It had been recorded on the condition that it would never be used, standard protocol for unsold creative meetings. And yet, here it was online. Weaponized. Framed not as artistic exploration or character development, but as confession, betrayal, insubordination. And it got worse. Because within 12 hours of the first leak, more clips surfaced. Not full-on rants, not scandalous exposés, but edited segments, strategically spliced and context-deprived. That painted Meghan as manipulative, bitter, scheming. One line was repeated on cable news with surgical precision. If they want war, they picked the wrong actress. It was a joke. A line said offhand with a smirk to lighten the tension in the room. But cut and looped on social media, it became damning. It confirmed the narrative the palace had been pushing behind the scenes, that Meghan saw the monarchy as a stage, the royals as characters, and herself as the director. But who leaked the footage? That was the question Meghan's legal team scrambled to answer. And within hours, they had a lead. Jessica Mulroney. Or rather, someone connected to her. Jessica, once Meghan's closest friend, stylist, and inner circle confidant, had been present at some of those early Hollywood meetings. Not as a producer, not as a guest, but as a fixer. A bridge between Meghan's former life and her post-royal ambitions. Back then, their bond had been unshakable. The two had shared vacations, secrets, and dreams. Jessica had helped coordinate Meghan's wardrobe for her final royal engagements. Had even once whispered to a staffer at Frogmore, "She's not just a duchess. She's a movement." But over time, the friendship fractured. Jessica's brand took a hit during the racial reckoning of 2020. Accusations, backlash, social media chaos. Meghan distanced herself. Publicly, quietly. And Jessica never recovered. Her show was pulled. Her clients vanished. And the press labeled her a cautionary tale. How to lose a duchess in 10 tweets. Now, years later, Meghan's team discovered something chilling. One of Jessica's former assistants, someone with access to early creative files, had allegedly sold raw footage to a content licensing firm. That firm, in turn, sold select pieces to tabloid-aligned media outlets. And according to a leaked invoice, one of those clips, the one with the wrong actress quote, sold for £17,000. Not for distribution. For damage. Meghan was livid. But not just at Jessica's orbit. At the realization that her story, her voice, her private moments were now public currency. And worse, being used to justify the palace's campaign to strip her of the very title she once wore with pride. She sat Harry down that night. No lawyers. No strategists. Just the two of them. "I know what this is now," she said. "They're not trying to win in court. They're trying to drown me in doubt before the judge ever reads a word." Harry nodded. "But what they don't understand," Meghan continued, "is that I have more footage. Real footage. Footage they forgot I had." He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" And that's when Meghan dropped the bomb. "I recorded my exit interviews." Silence. "What?" "I recorded my final meetings. With palace staff. With the communications team. Even with Edward Young. They didn't know. But I had to protect myself. I knew they'd spin it one day. I knew this would come." And with that, everything changed. Because Meghan wasn't defenseless anymore. She had receipts. The next morning, Meghan's legal team reviewed the footage. Several files. Audio only. But clear, time-stamped, and admissible. One clip featured a senior palace aide admitting, "We know the protocol's vague, but ambiguity works in our favor. The public will assume you broke something, even if you didn't." Another recording captured a strategy session about post-exit press coordination, where one royal comms director allegedly said, "We'll give the press enough rope to hang her. All we have to do is stay silent." And the most damning? A conversation between Meghan and a high-level palace advisor where she directly asked, "Are you saying I shouldn't speak at all?" The reply? "I'm saying the less you exist, the less trouble you cause." There it was. The smoking gun. Proof that the palace's strategy wasn't protection, it was erasure. Meghan sat with those files for hours. Listening. Rewinding. Listening again. And then she made a decision. She would go public. Not in a tabloid. Not in a press statement. But in a documentary. Meghan's team reached out to the same producer who had originally recorded those pitch sessions. The one who had never sold the footage, never betrayed her, and still believed in the power of storytelling. "I want to tell the truth," she said. "Not a tell-all. Just tell the truth." They agreed. Production began immediately. The documentary would be simple, elegant, no sensationalism, no drama, just voice, footage, recordings, context, a duchess reclaiming her voice, 1 minute at a time. And the working title? Redacted. But before the documentary could be released, before the public could hear those hidden conversations, the palace learned of its existence. And they panicked. Because if even a fraction of what Meghan recorded made it into the public domain, the monarchy's entire defense would crumble. The King's Council prepared a motion to suppress. A warning letter was drafted, but it was too late. The trailer was already scheduled, and the release